The mud in Grimm's Hollow was not merely dirt and water. It was a living, breathing entity that swallowed hope whole. It was a slurry of coal dust, horse manure, and the freezing sleet that had been falling for 3 days straight, coating the entire settlement in a sheen of gray misery. Sarah Miller stood on the auction block, an overturned crate that had once held mining explosives, and felt the mud seeping through the cracked leather of her boots. It was cold, a numbing bite that started at her toes and worked its way up her shins, settling deep in her bones. But the cold in her feet was nothing compared to the ice in her chest. She was 22 years old, but she felt ancient. Her hands were bound in front of her with a rough length of hemp rope that chafed her wrists raw. She kept her head down, her chin tucked into the collar of her threadbare wool coat, trying to hide, always hiding. The coat was too big for her, a cast-off from her stepfather, Amos Gentry. It smelled of stale tobacco and the sour metallic tang of cheap whiskey, a scent that made Sarah's stomach churn. But she pulled it tighter, using the oversized hood to shield the left side of her face. "Look alive, girl," Amos hissed, prodding her in the kidney with the handle of his walking stick. "You look like a corpse. Nobody buys a corpse unless they're planning a funeral." Sarah didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching only invited a harder blow. She stood rigid, her eyes fixed on a puddle of oil-slicked water near the saloon steps, watching the rain ripple the reflection of the gray sky. Around them, a crowd of about 30 men had gathered. They were a rough sort miners with coal-stained faces, trappers smelling of uncured pelts, and drifters who looked at her with hungry, hollow eyes. They huddled under the eaves of the saloon, passing bottles of rot gut between them, their breath steaming in the frigid air. "What are you selling, Gentry?" a man in the front shouted. He had a scar running through his lip that exposed a yellow tooth. "That coat looks worth more than the girl inside it." Laughter rippled through the crowd, a harsh, jagged sound like tin sheets scraping together. Amos bristled. He stepped up onto the crate beside Sarah, swaying slightly. The gin was already working on him, flushing his cheeks, a mottled purple. "I am selling a prime worker," Amos bellowed, his voice cracking. "Strong back, good teeth, cook, clean, mend. She can skin a buck in 5 minutes and tan the hide in 2 days. She's quiet, too. Don't speak unless spoken to. A man likes a quiet woman, don't he?" "She's small," another man grumbled. "Looks like a stiff breeze would snap her in half." "Wiry," Amos corrected, desperate. "She's wiry. Eats next to nothing. Low upkeep." He looked at the crowd. He saw the disinterest. He saw the boredom. He knew he was losing them. The debt collectors were coming for him at sundown, and if he didn't have $50, they would take his thumbs. He looked at Sarah. A flash of cruelty twisted his face. He grabbed her shoulder. "And she's got character," Amos sneered. Sarah went cold. "No," she prayed silently. "Please, not here, not in front of them." Amos grabbed the hood of her coat. He didn't pull it back gently. He yanked it. The wool fell away. Sarah gasped, instinctively trying to cover her face with her bound hands, but Amos slapped them down. "Look at that!" Amos shouted, gripping her jaw and forcing her head up, turning her left profile to the crowd. The silence that fell over the square was instant and heavy. The left side of Sarah's face was a ruin. It was a landscape of melted skin, a shiny, puckered map of pink and white scar tissue that ran from her temple, consumed her ear, and trailed down her neck like wax melting down a candle. It was the legacy of a house fire 10 years ago, a fire Amos had started, in a drunken stupor. "Fire-kissed," Amos declared, trying to spin the horror into a feature. "Tougher than leather. She survived hellfire, boys. She can survive your winters." The men didn't look impressed. They looked recoiled. Some looked away. Others stared with open, morbid fascination, like one stares at a 2-headed calf in a jar. "Damaged goods, Gentry," The man with the scar spat into the mud. "I ain't paying for a monster to scare my horses." $5, Amos pleaded, his desperation rising to a shriek. $5 for a lifetime of labor. Who starts the bidding? $2, a voice called from the back. "I need someone to muck out the pig stalls. Pigs don't care about pretty." Sarah closed her eyes. $2. She was worth less than a bag of feed. She felt a tear slide down her good cheek, hot and stinging against the cold wind. She wished the mud would just open up and swallow her. She wished she could dissolve into the gray rain and wash away into the gutter. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. $2 going once, Amos cried, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing rain. "Come on, gents. Look at those hands. They're workers' hands." He grabbed her hand and held it up. It was red, chapped and trembling. Suddenly, the horses at the hitching post whinnied a high panic sound. They stamped their hooves, pulling at their tethers, eyes rolling white with fear. The dogs that had been fighting over scraps under the boardwalk went silent. They slunk away, tails tucked between their legs, whining softly. A vibration traveled through the muddy ground. It wasn't the erratic stomp of the crowd. It was a heavy, rhythmic thud. Boom, boom, boom. The crowd parted. They didn't just step aside, they scrambled, backing into the walls of the saloon, tripping over themselves to clear the center of the street. A rider emerged from the mist at the edge of town. He rode a horse that looked more like a prehistoric beast than a mount, a massive black percheron with shaggy fettlocks and eyes like burning coals. Steam plumed from its nostrils in twin jets. But it was the rider who sucked the air from the square. He was a giant. He wore a coat made of unrefined wolf pelts, the gray fur matted with rain and snow, giving him the silhouette of a bipedal beast. A hood of fur shadowed his face, but beneath it, a beard as thick and black as the tangled undergrowth of the deep forest hid his features. Only his eyes were visible amber, predatory, and devoid of anything resembling human warmth. Caleb Thorne, the Wolf of Black Peak. The legend said he ate raw meat. The legend said he had killed a grizzly with a knife. The legend said he kidnapped women, and they were never seen again, their screams swallowed by the wind. He rode into the square. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the heavy squelch of the massive horse's hooves in the mud and the hiss of the rain. He stopped the horse 10 feet from the crate. The beast shook its head, the bridle jingling with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet. Caleb sat motionless. He looked at Amos. Then slowly, terrifyingly, his gaze shifted to Sarah. He looked at her coat. He looked at her bound hands. He looked at the scar. He didn't flinch. He didn't recoil. He leaned forward in the saddle, the leather groaning under his immense weight. He stared at the burned flesh, as if he were reading a map. Sarah stopped breathing. She felt like a rabbit frozen in the gaze of a predator. She could smell him from here, a potent mix of pine resin, wet fur, wood smoke, and old blood. It wasn't a dirty smell. It was a wild smell. It smelled like the deep woods where no sunlight ever reached. Amos was trembling so hard the crate shook beneath Sarah's feet. "Mr. Thorne," he stammered, clutching his hat. We didn't expect you down from the mountain until the thaw." Caleb didn't speak. He simply breathed, a cloud of white vapor escaping the dark tangle of his beard. She's for sale," Amos squeaked, his greed warring with his terror. "Good worker, strong, just a little marked up." Caleb shifted. He reached into the deep pocket of his wolfskin coat. The crowd flinched. Half the men reached for their belts, expecting a gun. Caleb pulled out his hand. It was massive, the size of a shovel head wrapped in rough leather. He didn't hold a gun, he held a rock. He tossed it. It wasn't a rock. It caught the dull light as it arched through the rain, a heavy, jagged lump of dull yellow. It hit the mud at Amos's feet with a heavy, wet thud. It didn't bounce. It was too heavy. Raw gold, the size of a hen's egg. Amos stared at it. His eyes bulged. That nugget was worth more than the saloon. It was worth more than the town. "Sold," Caleb growled. His voice was a landslide. It was deep, resonant, and scraped across the nerves like a file on bone. It wasn't a voice used to speaking to people. It was a voice used to shouting down storms. Amos scrambled off the crate, diving into the mud. He clawed at the muck, snatching up the gold, biting it, weeping with hysterical laughter. "Sold! Sold to the wolf! Take her! She's yours! No returns!" Caleb didn't look at Amos. He nudged his horse forward. The massive beast stepped right up to the crate, towering over Sarah. Sarah looked up. She was shaking so hard she thought her knees would buckle. She looked into those amber eyes and saw her death. "He's going to take me to his cave," she thought numbly. "He's going to eat me." Caleb reached down. Sarah flinched, turning her scarred face away, waiting for the blow. He didn't hit her. His hand closed around her upper arm. His grip was iron. It was unbreakable. But it didn't bruise. He didn't yank her. He lifted. Sarah gasped as her feet left the crate. He hoisted her into the air with one arm, as effortlessly as if she were a doll made of rags. He swung her up and across the saddle in front of him. She landed hard against his chest. The impact knocked the wind out of her. She was engulfed in fur. The smell of him was overwhelming now, musk and rain and power. He was hard as rock. He reached around her to grab the reins. His arm was a thick bar of muscle pressing against her ribs, caging her in. "Hold the mane," he rumbled against the top of her head. The vibration of his voice traveled through her skull. Sarah grabbed the horse's coarse black mane with her bound hands, burying her face in the wet hair to hide her terror. Caleb didn't look back at the town. He didn't look at the men who were staring with open mouths. He kicked the horse. The beast surged forward, splashing mud onto the bystanders. They turned away from the square, away from the pathetic figure of Amos Gentry counting his fortune in the dirt, and headed toward the tree line, toward the jagged, mist-shrouded peaks of Black Peak. Sarah closed her eyes as they passed the last house. She didn't cry. She had no tears left. She just held on, listening to the thunder of the horse's heart and the silence of the beast who had just bought her life with a stone. The ascent to Black Peak was a slow, terrifying crawl into the throat of the sky. The rain that had turned Grimm's Hollow into a sewer transformed, mile by agonizing mile, into sleet, and then into hard, driving snow that stung Sarah's face like blown sand. She sat rigid within the circle of Caleb Thorne's arms, terrified to move, terrified to lean back against the wall of wolf fur and muscle that caged her in. The heat radiating from him was the only thing keeping her blood moving, a furnace burning against her frozen spine. She couldn't see the path, if there even was one. The world was a swirling vortex of white, but Caleb navigated the treacherous, narrow switchbacks with a silent, terrifying competence. He didn't speak. He didn't curse the weather. He simply leaned into the wind, his massive body shielding her from the worst of the gale. Hours passed. The gray light faded to a deep, bruised purple as evening fell. Finally, the horse crested a ridge that seemed to jut out over the edge of the world. "Home," Caleb grunted. The vibration of his voice against her back made Sarah jump. She looked up. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress. The cabin was built directly into a recess in the cliff face, utilizing the living rock as its rear wall. Logs the size of bridge pilings, darkened by age and creosote, formed the front and sides, chinked with river clay that had frozen hard as iron. But it was the decorations that made her breath hitch. Hanging from the eaves, from the porch railing, from the lower branches of the gnarled pines surrounding the cabin, were bones. Bleached white skulls of elk, rib cages of deer, femurs of unknown beasts. They clattered in the wind, creating a haunting skeletal music that echoed off the canyon walls. Clack, clack, clack. Sarah stared at them with wide, terrified eyes. Totems, she thought. Warnings. This is where the monsters live. Caleb halted the horse. The wind here was a physical weight screaming over the peaks. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped into the snow, which was already knee-deep. He didn't seem to notice the cold. He reached up. "Come," he said. Sarah hesitated. Her legs were numb, useless blocks of ice. Her hands, still bound, were blue. Caleb didn't wait. He reached up, his massive hands spanning her waist. He didn't struggle. He didn't grunt. He pulled her from the saddle and held her suspended for a moment, looking at her with those amber eyes that seemed to strip away her defenses. Then he lowered her into the snow. She sank to her knees instantly, her frozen legs refusing to hold her. Caleb caught her by the scruff of her coat, hauling her upright like a sack of grain. He didn't speak. He simply turned and marched toward the cabin, dragging her along in his wake, his boots punching deep holes in the snow. He kicked the door, a sharp vibration through the floorboards, and shoved it open. He pulled her over the threshold and kicked the door shut behind them, dropping a heavy wooden bar into place. The sudden cessation of the wind's visual fury was jarring. The cabin was dim, lit only by the dying embers of a fire in a massive stone hearth. It smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, and something sweeter: cedar, strong, sharp cedar. Caleb released her. Sarah stumbled back against the rough log wall, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. It was a single large room that extended back into the cave. The walls were rough rock, slick with condensation. A bed in the corner was piled high with furs. A table sat in the center, cluttered with skinning knives, ammunition, traps, and dirty tin plates. It was a chaotic mess of steel and grease. Caleb walked to the hearth. He grabbed a poker and stabbed at the logs, sending sparks flying up the chimney. He threw a fresh log on, the fire roaring back to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the rock walls. He turned to her. He pulled a knife from his belt. Sarah gasped, pressing herself flat against the logs, squeezing her eyes shut. "This is it," she thought. "This is where he cuts me." She felt a tug on her wrists. The pressure of the rope vanished. She opened her eyes. The cut rope lay on the floor. Caleb was sheathing the knife. He pointed to the fire. Then he pointed to a stool. He gestured to his mouth, then to the larder. Sarah stood frozen. She didn't understand. Was he asking if she was hungry? Was he telling her to cook? His beard hid his lips, making it impossible to read them. Caleb frowned. The scar on his face pulled tight. He pointed again, more aggressively, at the larder. He made a motion of eating. Sarah stared at him, her hands trembling. She rubbed her chafed wrists, her mind racing. "I don't know what you want. Please don't hit me." Caleb let out a breath that puffed in the cold air. He stomped over to the table. He grabbed a tin cup. He slammed it down on the wood. Thud! Sarah felt the vibration travel through the floorboards and up her legs. She saw the dust jump on the table surface. Caleb paused. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. He stepped closer. He towered over her, a mountain of fur and shadow. He raised his hands. Clap! He brought his massive palms together right in front of her face. The air pressure hit her skin, causing her to blink, but she didn't flinch. She just stared at him, waiting. Caleb lowered his hands. His expression shifted. The irritation vanished, replaced by a strange, dawning comprehension. He looked at the scar on her face. He reached out. Sarah flinched this time, expecting a blow. He didn't strike. He grabbed a lock of her hair, wet and matted, and tucked it behind her ear. He looked at the ruined flesh. He grunted. He turned away. seemingly dismissing her existence. He grabbed a heavy canvas sack and his rifle. He walked to the door, unbarred it, and stepped back out into the storm, slamming it shut behind him. Sarah was alone. The silence of the cabin pressed in on her. It wasn't the fearful silence of the auction block. It was a heavy, ancient silence. She looked around. The cabin was a disaster. Not filthy exactly, but neglected. A layer of dust coated the shelves. The floor was unswept, littered with pine needles and dried mud. The table was a graveyard of half-finished projects. She looked at the fire. It was the only friend she had here. She looked at the table. Among the clutter lay a set of skinning knives. They were dull, the edges nicked and abused. A whetstone lay nearby, dry and unused. Sarah moved. She found a bucket of water near the door frozen over. She broke the ice with a ladle and scooped out a bowlful. She drank greedily, the cold water shocking her empty stomach. Then she found a rag. She went to the table. She picked up the largest knife. It was a beautiful piece of steel, bone-handled, but neglected. It was heavy in her hand. "I am not a pet," she thought fiercely. "I am not broken stock. I am useful." She sat on the stool. She wet the stone. She began to work. She sharpened the knives until they gleamed. She organized the table. She stacked the ammunition boxes. She hung the traps on the pegs by the door. She found a broom made of twigs and swept the floor. She found a piece of dried venison in the larder and cut it into strips with a newly sharpened knife. She put them in a pot with water and hung it over the fire. Hours passed. The light in the room shifted as the day died outside. The door opened. A gust of snow blew in, swirling across the clean floor. Caleb stepped inside, carrying a massive log on his shoulder. He stopped. He looked at the floor. Clean. He looked at the table. Orderly. He smelled the broth bubbling on the fire. He dropped the log by the hearth with a thud that shook the cabin. He walked to the table. He picked up his skinning knife. He ran his thumb lightly over the edge. A drop of blood welled up instantly, dark and round. He looked at the knife. Then he looked at Sarah. She was standing by the hearth, twisting her apron in her hands, waiting for his judgment, waiting to be told she had done it wrong, waiting to be hit. Caleb wiped his thumb on his trousers. He looked at the knife again, turning it in the firelight. It was sharper than it had been the day he bought it. He looked at her. He didn't smile. She wasn't sure he knew how, but the tension in his shoulders dropped an inch. He nodded. A single sharp dip of his chin. "Good." He pulled off the stool and sat, gesturing for her to sit opposite him. He cut a piece of the venison with the knife, the blade parting the flesh effortlessly, and pushed it toward her. It was a silent truce, a recognition. She wasn't just a mouth to feed. She was a pair of hands, and in the high mountains, hands were the difference between life and death. Suddenly, Caleb frowned. He reached for a heavy canvas grain sack on the floor near his feet. There was a tear in the corner, spilling oats onto the clean floor. He grunted in frustration. He grabbed a bone needle and a spool of thick thread from the shelf. He tried to thread the needle. His hands were massive, calloused, and stiff from the cold. He held the tiny needle between his thumb and forefinger like a bear trying to hold a snowflake. He squinted, trying to push the frayed thread through the eye. He missed. He tried again. He missed. He growled low in his throat, a sound of pure frustration. Sarah watched him. She saw the tremor in his hands. She saw the struggle. Without thinking, she stood up. She walked around the table. Caleb tensed as she approached, his eyes flicking up to her face. Sarah didn't flinch. She reached out. She gently took the needle from his hand. She took the thread. She bit the end of the thread to make it sharp. In one fluid, practiced motion, she slid the thread through the eye of the needle. She handed it back to him. Caleb stared at the threaded needle. He stared at her hand, small, scarred, but steady. He looked up at her face. For the first time, he saw past the scar. He saw the competence. He saw the quiet strength of a woman who had survived fire and auction blocks and was still standing. He took the needle. His fingers brushed hers, rough against smooth. He didn't say thank you. He simply nodded again, deeper this time. He turned back to the sack, his movement slower now, more careful, as if he was suddenly aware of how much space he took up in the room and how easily he could crush the fragile thing that had just mended his world. The blizzard that descended on Black Peak was not merely a weather event, it was a siege. For 3 days and 3 nights, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. There was only the white, screaming void pressing against the logs, piling drifts so high they blocked the single window, sealing Sarah and Caleb in a twilight world of firelight and shadows. The cabin became a capsule of heat and cedar scent. Sarah, who had spent her life shrinking into corners to avoid blows, found that in this small space, there were no corners to hide in. She moved around Caleb like a moon orbiting a planet, careful, quiet, but constantly aware of his gravity. He was everywhere. He filled the room with his sighs, his smell, his silence. On the 4th afternoon, though it was hard to tell time in the gloom, the wind shifted. It didn't stop, but it changed from a scream to a low, mournful moan. Caleb stood abruptly from the table where he had been oiling his traps. A sudden movement made the candle flame dance. He grabbed his heavy coat, the fur now dry and bristling, and threw it over his shoulders. He didn't speak to Sarah. He simply unbarred the door. A wall of snow collapsed inward, spilling across the floor. He shoved his way out, disappearing into the white. Sarah rushed to the door, shoving the snow back with a broom, and forced it shut. She barred it, her heart hammering. He left, she thought. He left me here to freeze. But 20 minutes later, a heavy thud shook the door. Sarah opened it. Caleb stumbled in. He was covered in snow from head to toe, looking like a yeti. His beard was a block of ice. He was hunched over, clutching something against his chest, shielding it with his body. He kicked the door shut and leaned against it, gasping for breath. The cold radiating off him was intense. He walked to the hearth and knelt. He opened his coat. Sarah took a step back, expecting to see a dead animal, a rabbit or a marten he had checked from a trap. It was gray. It was furry, but it was alive. A coyote pup. It couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. It was shivering so violently its teeth were clicking. Its eyes were squeezed shut, matted with ice. Caleb, the monster of Grimm's Hollow, the man who supposedly ate raw meat, looked down at the tiny, dying creature with an expression of profound concern. "Lost," he rumbled. His voice was rough, unused. "Pack moved on, left the runt." He looked at Sarah, then at the milk pail near the door. Sarah understood. She grabbed a small tin cup and poured a little goat's milk into it. She brought it to him, her hand trembling slightly. Caleb took the cup. His fingers were so large they swallowed it. He dipped a calloused finger into the milk and held it to the pup's snout. The pup didn't move. "Come on, little killer," Caleb whispered. It was a sound Sarah had never heard, soft, crooning, almost playful. He rubbed the milk on the pup's gums. Suddenly, the pup sneezed. It opened one blue, cloudy eye. It smelled the milk. It latched onto Caleb's finger and began to suckle, making desperate, high-pitched mewling sounds. Caleb chuckled. It was a low, rusty sound, like stones grinding together deep underground. "Hungry," he murmured. "Yes, eat. Get strong, bite the winter back." Sarah watched, mesmerized. She had seen men kick dogs. She had seen Amos drown a sack of kittens in the river because they were useless mouths. She had never seen a man, let alone a giant like this, nurse a dying thing. The pup drank the cup dry. Then, reinvigorated by the warmth and food, it did what wild things do. It bit him. It clamped its tiny needle-sharp teeth onto the fleshy part of Caleb's thumb and growled a ferocious tiny sound like a zipper being pulled fast. Caleb didn't shake it off. He didn't hit it. He gasped, feigning a mortal wound. He pulled his hand back, dragging the hanging pup with it. "Oh!" Caleb cried out, his voice pitched high in mock terror. "A monster! A beast! I am slaying! The wolf is taken down by the cub!" He fell back onto the bearskin rug, letting the pup climb onto his chest. He wrestled with it, using one giant finger to gently pin the snapping, growling ball of fluff. He growled back at it, nuzzling its belly with his nose. "You are fierce," Caleb told the pup, laughing as it attacked his beard. "You will rule the mountain." It was absurd. It was impossible. The terrified mountain man rolling on the floor with a puppy, acting like a fool. Sarah felt something bubble up in her throat. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a sob. It was sharp and strange, and it pushed against her ribs until it burst out. She laughed. It started as a snort, a sudden release of pressure. Then it became a giggle. And then, as Caleb looked up with the pup chewing on his ear, it turned into a full, bell-clear peal of laughter. It rang through the cabin, bouncing off the logs, brighter than the fire, louder than the wind. It was the sound of a woman who had forgotten she had a voice finding it again. Caleb froze. The pup yipped and scrambled off his chest, scurrying under the table. Caleb sat up slowly. The playfulness vanished from his face, replaced by a look of utter shock. He stared at Sarah, as if she had just grown wings. Sarah clapped her hand over her mouth. The laughter died in her throat. Her eyes went wide. "I made noise," she thought in panic. "I mocked him. He will kill me." She backed away, hitting the wall. I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" Caleb didn't speak. He stood up. He loomed over the room again, the wolf returning. He walked toward her. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, turning her scarred face to the wall, waiting for the backhand, waiting for the anger. He stopped inches from her. She could feel his heat. She could smell the wet wool and the milk. "Do it again," he whispered. Sarah opened her eyes. She looked up at him. He wasn't angry. He looked hungry, not for meat, but for the sound. "What?" she breathed. "The sound," Caleb said, struggling to find the words. Like a creek breaking in spring, like bells." He reached out. Sarah flinched, pulling her head down. Caleb stopped his hand in midair. He waited until she settled. Then, very slowly, he reached out again. He didn't touch her good cheek. He didn't touch her hair. He touched the scar. His fingertips were rough, calloused from years of chopping wood and skinning game, but his touch was feather-light. He traced the ridge of melted skin that ran from her temple to her jaw. He followed the path of the fire that had ruined her life. Sarah trembled. No one touched the scar. People looked away. Amos had called it her mark of sin. "Fire," Caleb whispered. He looked into her eyes, his amber gaze intense and unblinking. "Fire burns away the weak wood, leaves only the iron heart." He moved his thumb across the puckered skin. "They see the burn," he rumbled. "I see the steel." Sarah let out a shuddering breath. Tears leaked from her eyes, tracking through the scar tissue. "It's ugly," she whispered. "I'm a monster." Caleb shook his head. "No." He took her hand, the one that had mended his sack, the one that had fed the pup, and placed it on his own chest. It was hard as rock, but beneath the muscle she felt his heart. It was beating slow and strong. "I have scars too," he said softly, "inside, where the silence lives." He looked at the fire. his eyes distant. "I had a wife," he confessed. The words were heavy, dragged up from a deep well, 10 years ago. "And a daughter, small, like the pup." Sarah's breath hitched. She hadn't known. "Sickness took them," Caleb said. "Winter fever. The snow was too deep. I couldn't get the doctor. I held them. I watched the light go out." He looked back at Sarah. "The silence after. It was too loud. I couldn't stand the town. I couldn't stand the voices. So I came here, where the wind is louder than the ghosts." He leaned closer. His forehead touched hers. It was a breach of space, an intimacy that was terrified and terrifying. "I forgot the sound of laughter," he whispered. "I thought it was gone from the world, until you—" He pulled back slightly, looking at her with a fierce, protective intensity. "You are not a monster, Sarah Miller. You are the spark that relit my fire." Sarah looked at him. She saw the man beneath the beast. She saw the loneliness that matched her own. She saw a man who had built a fortress of bones to keep the world out, only to let a scarred girl and a coyote pup in. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his hand, closing her eyes, feeling the roughness of his palm against the ruin of her face. And for the first time in 10 years, she didn't feel burned. She felt warm. "Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below." The spring thaw arrived not with a gentle promise of flowers, but with the violent weeping of the mountain. The snow that had entombed the cabin for months turned heavy and gray, sloughing off the granite peaks in wet, thundering sheets. The creek, which had been a silent ribbon of ice, roared back to life, brown and swollen with mud, tearing at its banks like a caged animal desperately seeking escape. Sarah stood at the wash basin near the window, her hands deep in warm, soapy water. The scar on her face itched in the damp air, a phantom reminder of fire, but the tension in her shoulders was gone. She hummed a low, tuneless melody, watching through the cracked pane as Caleb worked in the yard. He was a force of nature. He had stripped off his heavy coat, working in just his undershirt despite the chill that still hung in the valley. His breath plumed in white clouds with every swing of the axe. Thwack! The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic. Thwack! A log of seasoned pine split cleanly in two. Thwack! He paused to wipe sweat from his brow with his forearm, his chest heaving. He looked toward the cabin window. He couldn't see her clearly through the condensation, but he knew she was there. He lingered for a moment, his posture softening, a man guarding his treasure, not with greed, but with reverence. Then the birds stopped singing. It wasn't a gradual silence. It was an instant, terrified hush. The jays that had been squabbling over the wood chips vanished. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Caleb went still. The axe hung loose in his hand. He tilted his head, his ears twitching like the wolf he was named for. Sarah felt the vibration before she heard the sound. The water in the basin rippled. Thud, thud, thud. Hoofbeats, many of them, unshod, heavy, scrambling up the shale path that only a desperate or greedy man would attempt in the mud season. Caleb turned slowly toward the tree line. He didn't run for his rifle, which leaned against the porch railing 10 yards away. He stood his ground, gripping the handle of the axe, until his knuckles turned white. The riders emerged from the mist like wraiths. There were 6 of them, rough men in long dusters, their faces obscured by scarves and low hats. They rode horses that looked ridden hard, their flanks heaving, mud caking their bellies. And leading them on a pale, skittish mare was Amos Gentry. Sarah gasped, dropping the plate she was washing. It shattered on the floor, but she didn't hear it. Her blood turned to ice. Amos looked different. He wasn't the desperate, shuffling drunk of the auction block. He wore a new coat too big, too clean, and his eyes burned with a feverish, manic greed. He reined his horse in at the edge of the clearing. He spotted Caleb standing by the woodpile. "There he is," Amos shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. "The beast, and the mine is right behind him." He pointed a shaking finger at the cabin, at the cliff face it was built into. He didn't see a home. He saw the source of the gold nugget Caleb had tossed in the mud. He saw a fortune he believed he had been cheated out of. "Mr. Thorne," Amos called out, mocking politeness dripping from his tone, "I'm afraid there was a clerical error with the sale. You bought the girl, but you didn't buy the mineral rights." Caleb didn't speak. He stepped forward, placing himself between the riders and the cabin door. His silence was louder than a scream. "Get out of the way, freak!" One of the hired guns, a man with a scarred nose and a sawed-off shotgun, yelled. "We're here for the gold!" Caleb shifted his grip on the axe. "Leave," he rumbled. The sound carried across the clearing, deep and vibrating with lethal promise. "Or stay forever." Amos laughed, a high, nervous titter. "Kill him! Kill the savage and find the vein!" The man with the shotgun raised his weapon. Boom! The sound shattered the mountain peace. Caleb spun. The slug caught him high in the left shoulder. A spray of crimson mist painted the white snow behind him. The impact threw him backward, spinning him around. He hit the mud hard. "No!" Sarah screamed. The sound tore from her throat, raw and primal. She ran to the door, fumbling with the latch. "He's down!" Amos cheered, kicking his horse forward. "Get inside! Grab the girl! She knows where he keeps it!" But Caleb Thorne did not stay down. He was not a man. He was the mountain given flesh. He rolled onto his knees. A low, guttural roar started in his chest, building in volume, until it shook the remaining snow from the pine boughs. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, the sound of a predator whose den has been breached. He grabbed the axe with his good hand. He stood up. The gunman who had shot him was reloading, fumbling with the break action of his weapon. He looked up and saw the giant rising from the mud, blood streaming down his arm, eyes glowing with a terrifying amber light. "He ain't human," the gunman stammered. Caleb charged. He moved with a speed that defied his size. He covered the distance in 3 strides. He didn't swing the axe like a woodchopper. He swung it like a warhammer. The flat of the axe head connected with the gunman's horse. The animal screamed and reared, throwing the rider. The man hit the ground with a bone-jarring crunch. Caleb didn't stop. A second rider spurred his horse, trying to trample him. Caleb dropped the axe and grabbed the horse's bridle with his good hand. He bellowed, twisting his torso, using the animal's own momentum against it. He forced the horse's head down, sending it crashing into the mud, pinning the rider beneath its bulk. He retrieved the axe. He turned to the remaining men. He was covered in mud, and blood his own and theirs. He looked like a demon dragged up from the pits of hell. "Come on," he roared, challenging them, challenging the world. "Come and take it." The remaining hired guns hesitated. They were paid to kill a hermit, not fight a legend. But while the chaos erupted in the yard, one man, a wiry, rat-faced tracker, who had dismounted early, had skirted the edge of the clearing. He slipped up the porch steps while Caleb was engaging the riders. Sarah heard the heavy boots on the wood planks. She backed away from the window. She looked for a weapon. The rifle was outside. The skinning knives were on the table, too far away. The door burst open. The tracker stood there, a long hunting knife in his hand. He grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Well now," he sneered, stepping into the warmth of the cabin. "Daddy said you were ugly, but he didn't say you were hiding in a palace." He advanced on her. "Where's the gold, scarred face? You tell me, and maybe I don't cut the other side to match." Sarah backed up until her hips hit the cast-iron stove. It was hot. She had been baking bread. The heat radiated through her dress. She looked at the man. She saw the cruelty in his eyes. She saw the knife. But she didn't see the little girl who had hidden in the cellar. She didn't see the victim who had been sold for a nugget. She saw the woman who had laughed with a wolf. She saw the woman who had mended a giant's clothes. I am not a victim, she thought, the realization hitting her like a bolt of lightning. I am part of this pack. Her hand reached behind her. It found the handle of the massive cast-iron skillet sitting on the burner. It was heavy. It was smoking hot. The bacon grease inside was popping. The tracker lunged, reaching for her hair. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't beg. She swung. She used both hands, putting every ounce of her frustration, every year of her silence, every moment of her pain into the motion. The heavy iron pan connected with the side of the tracker's head with a deafening clang that sounded like a church bell ringing judgment. Hot grease sprayed across his face. The man shrieked a high, bubbling sound of agony. He dropped the knife, clutching his face, staggering back. The impact had shattered his nose and likely his cheekbone. My eyes, he screamed, falling to his knees. Sarah stood over him. She raised the skillet again. Her chest was heaving, her scar throbbed, but she felt no pain. She felt powerful. Get out, she hissed. Her voice was low, dangerous. It sounded like Caleb's. Get out of my house. Outside, the gunfire had stopped. Sarah stepped over the moaning man and walked onto the porch, the skillet still gripped in her white-knuckled hand. The yard was a scene of carnage. 3 men lay groaning in the mud. 2 others were fleeing into the tree line, their horses panicked. Caleb stood in the center of the yard. He was leaning heavily on the axe handle, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, blood soaking his undershirt. And facing him, trapped between the woodpile and the creek, was Amos Gentry. Amos had fallen from his horse. He was crawling backward through the slush, holding up his hands. Now, Caleb, Mr. Thorne, Amos babbled, his face gray with terror. It was a misunderstanding, a joke, just a family visit. Caleb took a step forward. He dragged the axe through the mud. He didn't look like a man anymore. The pain, the blood, the adrenaline had stripped away the humanity Sarah had nurtured. He was the savage beast the town feared. He raised the axe. No! Amos screamed, curling into a ball. Mercy, I'm her father! Caleb froze. The axe hovered at the apex of its swing. He looked up at the porch. He saw Sarah. She was standing at the railing. She was unhurt. She held a cast-iron skillet like a shield. She looked fierce. She looked wild. She looked at him. She didn't look afraid of the blood. She didn't look afraid of the axe. She nodded. Once. It wasn't permission to kill. It was permission to end it. Caleb looked back down at Amos, the man who had burned her face, the man who had sold her, the man who had brought war to his sanctuary. You are not a father, Caleb growled, his voice vibrating with the force of the mountain. You are a transaction. He didn't swing the axe at Amos's head. He swung it at the ground, inches from Amos's face, burying the blade deep into the frozen earth with a force that shook the ground. Thud. Amos screamed, thinking he was dead. Caleb leaned down, his face inches from the sobbing man. The debt is paid, Caleb whispered. If I see you again, I will not miss. He straightened up. He pointed a blood-stained finger toward the valley. Run. Amos didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet, slipping and sliding in the mud, weeping openly. He ran past his fallen hired guns, past the terrified horses, and disappeared into the trees without looking back. Caleb watched him go. He stood there like a statue carved from bloody marble, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving only the pain and the cold. He swayed. The axe handle slipped from his grasp. He turned toward the porch. He looked at Sarah. He took one step toward her, his hand reaching out. Sarah, he rasped. Then his eyes rolled back. His knees buckled. The wolf of Black Peak collapsed face first into the mud, the red stain on his shoulder spreading out to claim him. The mud was cold against her knees, soaking through her dress instantly as she fell beside him. Sarah didn't feel the chill. She didn't feel the throbbing of her own hands, where she had gripped the heavy skillet. All she felt was the terrifying stillness of the mountain that lay face down in the slush. "Caleb?" Her voice was a raw tear in the silence of the valley. He didn't move. The red stain on the back of his shoulder was spreading, blooming across the gray wool of his shirt like a dark, violent flower. Sarah didn't waste time checking for a pulse. She could see the faint, ragged rise and fall of his ribs. He was alive, but the mountain was trying to claim him back. She grabbed his good arm, her small hands slipping on the wet fabric. She pulled. He was immovable. He was 300 pounds of bone and muscle, dead weight in the sucking mud. She gritted her teeth, digging her boots into the slush, and heaved with a strength she didn't know she possessed, a strength born of terror and a fierce, possessive love. "Get up, you stubborn old bear," she hissed, tears hot on her cheeks. "You don't get to sleep. Not yet." She couldn't lift him, so she dragged him. Inch by agonizing inch, she hauled him toward the porch. Her boots slipped. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps that burned her lungs. She grabbed him by the collar of his coat, the leather cutting into her palms, and pulled until her shoulders screamed. It took 10 minutes to get him up the 3 steps. She used a plank of firewood as a lever to hoist his hips over the threshold. She collapsed on the floor beside him, gasping, her chest heaving. The cabin was warm, the air still thick with the smell of burned bacon grease and the copper tang of violence. She scrambled up. "Focus," she told herself. "He fixed the pup. You fix the wolf." She barred the door. Though the threat was gone, the instinct remained. She built up the fire until it roared. She dragged the heavy dining table closer to where he lay, shoving it with her hip. She couldn't get him onto the bed. The floor would have to do. She grabbed the shears from the shelf. She cut the shirt away from his shoulder. The fabric peeled back with a wet, sticky sound that made her stomach turn. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of the trapezius muscle. It was ugly, a jagged hole that oozed dark blood with every beat of his heart, but it hadn't hit the lung. If it had, there would be pink froth. There was only blood. "Clean it, close it, bind it," she recited, remembering the way he had tended to the coyote pup's paw weeks ago. She fetched the whiskey bottle from the cupboard. She poured it over the wound. Caleb's body jerked. A low, guttural groan escaped his lips, his eyes fluttering but not opening. His hand the size of a dinner plate clenched into a fist, striking the floorboards with a thud. "I know," Sarah whispered, her hands shaking as she threaded the bone needle, the same needle she had taken from him that first night. "I'm sorry. I have to." She held the needle in the flame of the candle until the tip glowed orange. She began to sew. The skin was tough, resistant. She had to push hard to drive the needle through. Caleb grunted with every pass, his breathing hitching in shallow gasps. Sarah wept silently as she worked, her tears falling onto his bare back, mixing with the blood and the whiskey. She stitched the ragged edges of the savage beast back together, murmuring soft, nonsensical words of comfort that she wasn't sure he could hear. "Stay with me. You promised. You promised to teach me the song." When the last stitch was tied off, she bandaged the wound with strips of clean linen from her petticoat. She covered him with the heavy fur blankets from the bed. She sat on the floor beside his head, stroking the tangled black hair away from his sweating forehead. She watched the rise and fall of his chest. She watched the light in the window shift from the gray of the storm to the deep bruised purple of twilight, and finally to the ink black of night. She didn't sleep. She sat vigil, a small, scarred gargoyle guarding her sleeping giant. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, the rhythm of his breathing changed. It deepened. Caleb opened his eyes. They were glassy, rimmed with red, but the amber fire was there, burning low. He looked at the ceiling beams. He looked at the fire. He looked at her. He tried to push himself up. "No," Sarah said firmly, placing a hand on his good shoulder. "Down." Caleb groaned, collapsing back onto the furs. He blinked, the memory of the day crashing down on him, the gunshot, the axe, the blood. He looked at Sarah. He saw the soot on her cheek. He saw the dried blood on her apron, his blood. He closed his eyes, a look of profound shame twisting his features. "You stayed," he rasped. His voice was a wreck, like gravel in a grinder. "Where else would I go?" Sarah asked softly, dipping a rag in cool water and wiping his brow. Caleb turned his head away from her touch. "Away," he whispered. "You should have gone, while I was down." He opened his eyes and looked at the door. "The gold," he mumbled, "under the floorboard by the hearth. Take it. Take the horse. Go to the city." Sarah froze. Her hand hovered over his forehead. "Why?" "Look at this," Caleb growled, gesturing weakly to the room, to his wound, to the violence that lingered in the air like smoke. "I am a magnet for blood, Sarah. I am a beast. They will always come for me. They will always try to kill the monster." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "Today it was Amos. Tomorrow it will be someone else. I cannot watch you bleed because of me." He tried to sit up again, fighting the pain, driven by a desperate need to save her from himself. "You deserve softness," he choked out. "You deserve a house with windows that don't need bars. You deserve a man who doesn't smell of death." He reached out, his hand trembling, and pushed the bag of coins she had left on the table toward her. "Go," he commanded, though his voice broke. "Run from the wolf, Sarah, before he eats you." Sarah looked at the bag. She looked at the door. She stood up. Caleb watched her, his heart breaking in his chest. He expected her to take the money. He expected her to run. It was what everyone did. It was what he deserved. Sarah walked to the door. She checked the bar. It was solid. She walked back to the fire. She picked up the cast-iron skillet, the weapon she had used to defend their home. She set it on the stove with a deliberate clang. She turned to him. "You think I want softness?" she asked, her voice quiet but steel hard. She knelt beside him again. She didn't touch his hand. She touched his face. She ran her fingers into his beard, cupping his jaw, forcing him to look at her. She turned her face, so the firelight hit her scar, the melted, ruined flesh that the world called ugly. "Look at me, Caleb," she ordered. He looked. He didn't see the scar. He saw the woman. "I have lived in softness," Sarah said, her voice trembling with intensity. "The town is soft. The people who watched me burn were soft. My stepfather was a civilized man who wore suits and went to church." She leaned closer, her eyes burning into his. "Softness didn't save me. Softness let me burn. Softness sold me for a rock." She moved her hand down to his chest, placing it over his heart. "You call yourself a beast," she whispered, "but you are the only thing in this world that has ever made me feel safe. You are the only one who looked at my face and didn't flinch." "I am dangerous," Caleb argued weakly. "So am I," Sarah countered. A small, fierce smile touched her lips. "I branded a man today, Caleb. I stood on the porch and I wasn't afraid, because I am part of this pack now." She leaned down and kissed his cheek, right above the beard, right where the blood had dried. "I don't want a house with glass windows," she vowed against his skin. "I want the bone chimes. I want the wind. I want the wolf." Caleb stared at her. The breath left his lungs. He looked for fear in her eyes and found only a fierce, terrifying loyalty. She wasn't a captive. She wasn't a victim. She was his equal. He reached up with his good hand. He tangled his fingers in her hair, pulling her down until her forehead rested against his. "I have nothing to give you," he whispered brokenly. "Only this mountain, only this blood." "Then give it to me," Sarah breathed. "Give me all of it." Caleb let out a shuddering sigh, a sound of surrender. He closed his eyes, wrapping his arm around her waist, anchoring her to him. "Yours," he rumbled. "It is all yours." The wind outside howled, rattling the bones on the eaves, but inside, the fire burned steady and warm. The beast didn't eat the girl. The girl tamed the beast, not with chains, but with the terrifying power of choosing to stay. Epilogue 1 year later. The spring melt had come and gone, leaving the high meadow of Black Peak lush with wildflowers, bluebells, and Indian paintbrush that swayed in the gentle breeze. The air smelled of pine resin and the sweet, earthy scent of thawing soil. A group of fur traders, 3 men with mules laden with pelts, wound their way up the narrow switchback trail. They moved quietly, their eyes darting to the tree line, hands hovering near their rifles. "I'm telling you, it ain't right," the youngest trader whispered, wiping sweat from his neck. "We shouldn't be up here. This is the wolf's territory. They say he keeps a woman in a cage. They say you can hear her screaming at night." The older trader, a man named Silas who had walked these mountains for 20 years, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the rocks. "Legends, boy. Just stories to scare the greenhorns, though. I admit, I ain't never seen a man go up here and come back the same." They crested the ridge. The cabin came into view. It was still formidable, built into the rock face like a swallow's nest. The bones still hung from the eaves, bleached white by the sun. But something was different. The bones weren't just clattering. They were arranged, tuned. As the wind swept through the canyon, the rib cages and hollow femurs didn't sound like a death rattle. They sounded like woodwinds, a hollow, haunting melodic chime that harmonized with the rushing creek. The trader stopped. "Listen," Silas hissed. It wasn't a scream. Coming from the porch of the cabin, carried on the clear mountain air, was a sound that didn't belong in the savage wilderness. It was singing. 2 voices. One was deep, a bass rumble like the earth moving, rough and scarred but steady. The other was high and clear, a bell-like soprano that wove around the lower notes like ivy climbing an oak tree. They were singing an old folk ballad, something about a river and a ring. On the porch, sitting on a wide bench hewn from a split log, was the giant. Caleb Thorne was repairing a fishing net, his movements slow and contented. His beard was trimmed, and he wore a shirt of clean blue flannel. Beside him sat Sarah. She was no longer hiding in a hood. Her face was bare to the sun, the scar shining silver in the light, a badge of survival she wore with pride. She was shelling peas into a bowl, her head resting on Caleb's shoulder as they sang. A massive black dog, half wolf, half shadow, slept at their feet, its tail thumping rhythmically against the floorboards. The trader stood there for a long moment, stunned into silence by the domesticity of the scene. There was no cage. There were no chains. There was only a peace so profound, it felt like holy ground. "Well," the young trader whispered, lowering his rifle, "I'll be damned." Silas smiled, shaking his head. "Reckon the legends got it wrong, boy. The beast didn't eat the girl." He tipped his hat to the couple on the porch, though they were too far away to see it. "Looks to me like the girl saved the beast." The traders turned their mules around, deciding not to disturb the sanctuary. They headed back down the mountain, carrying with them a new story, not of a monster and a victim, but of a song that turned the wind into music and a love that had made the savage mountain home. The singing followed them down the valley, a lingering promise that even in the wildest places, something beautiful could grow.